speaker today, Dr. Francis Robinson, truly needs no introduction. He is Professor of the History of South Asia, Royal Holloway, University of London, and was educated at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he studied for his doctorate and was Prize Fellow from 1969 to 73. He was lecturer in history at Royal Holloway from 1973 to 85, then reader in history from 1985 to 90, before being appointed to a professorship in 1990. He was Sultan of Ottoman Fellow, Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, and visiting professor in the History of the Islamic World, University of Oxford, 2008 to 12. He has held visiting professorships at the University of Washington and Directeur des études associées, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Paris. He was president of the Royal Asiatic Society from 1977 to 2000, and from 2003 to 6. In 1978, he was awarded the Iqbal Centenary Medal Pakistan, and in 2008, the Sheikh Yaqi Zamani Medal, Iqbal Academy, UK. Dr. Robinson's research primarily attempts to address religious change in the Muslim world from the 18th century to the present, with a particular focus on South Asia. He has had, in his own words, the great advantage of working on the private papers of the Farangi Mahal family of Lucknow, the leading family of Islamic learning in South Asia for nearly 3 centuries, through which he attempted to explore the great movement of revival and reform which has swept through the Muslim world since the 18th century. He has published extensively on aspects of the Muslim world, including The Islamic World in the Age of Western Domination in 2010, The Mughals and the Islamic Dynasties of India, Iran, and Central Asia, 1206 to 1925 in 2007, and many others. In more recent contexts, it was personally heartwarming for me to read an interview with The Week magazine that Dr. Robinson graciously consented to, in which he uses the wide-scale bias mitigated towards the Tablighi Jamaat gatherings of 2020 as a case study to illustrate how right-wing elements are using the pandemic as a reason to harass Muslims. In his own words, there are elements in India who will use any stick to beat the Muslim. The 21st century is not a pleasant time to be a Muslim in India. I'm sure all of us eagerly await, I definitely do, for a critical examination of whether or not patterns of religio-political oppression on these lines have longer antecedents than is often emphasized. Professor Robinson's lecture today is titled On How Since 1800 Islamic Societies Have Been Built From Below. Sir, it is a great pleasure and an honor to have you here with us today. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Bipasha, thank you for that excellent introduction. For 1,000 years and more, as Bernard Lewis once put it, Islam walked hand in hand with power. The basic infrastructure of Islamic societies, the mosque, madrasas, the administration of the law, the wider activities of ulama were for the most part supported by Muslim political power. Some religious institutions which played an important part in popular Islamic life, for instance, Sufis and the shrines of Sufi saints, at times strove to distance themselves from the wielders of political power. On the other hand, the powerful usually sought to patronize the Sufis, and sometimes the Sufis were very happy to be patronized. For 1,000 years and more, Muslim power and the Islamic infrastructure of Muslim societies were closely intertwined. This all changed with the spread of Western power and influence to the Muslim world. Key moments in this process were Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 and Wellesley's conquest of the last major Muslim power in India at Seringapatam in 1799. From now on, the European tide flowed fast. The British were the hegemonic power in India by 1818 and had conquered all of it by the mid-19th century. At the same time, the British and Dutch completed their conquests of Malaya and Indonesia. In the 30 years before World War I, the British, French, Germans, and Italians divided Muslim Africa between them. During World War I, the British and French divided the Middle East between them. And at the same time, the Russians completed their conquest of the Caucasus and Central Asia. By 1920, in what remained of the Muslim-ruled world, the Iranians had been subjected to a humiliating treaty by the British, and the remnant of the Ottoman army was fighting for its life in Anatolia as the great powers started to dismember it. The only lands free of Western power were Afghanistan, North Yemen, and what is now Saudi Arabia. Western power meant an assault on the Islamic infrastructure of Muslim societies. In South Asia, British power meant an end of government support for Islamic education. The British saw no point in good revenue being used to support learning, which, after their utilitarian fashion, they considered worthless. So steadily, in Bengal and northern India, they resumed the grants which sometimes for centuries had supported Islamic learning. By the same token, they no longer found room in their bureaucracy for men with Islamic learning. The training of an alim, a Muslim learned man, was no longer a route to government service. From now on, Muslims had to acquire Western knowledge and pass British exams if they were to rule. On occasion, the British also removed the government grants which supported Sufi shrines, but not always. The British noted that landed Sufis in Sindh and the Punjab might be bulwarks on which their power might rest. At the same time, the British imposed English law in the public sphere, narrowing down the sphere of Islamic law to the personal law, that involving marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Even this became increasingly anglicized, as first the advice of Islamic legal experts, ulama in the form of qadis, was removed from court proceedings. And second, the law itself became increasingly divorced from its Islamic starting point, as the application of common law principles of justice, equity, and good conscience were applied by British judges. South Asian Muslims came to live at an increasing distance from the sources of revelation which should inform an Islamic society. In the Ottoman Empire, and subsequently Republican Turkey, there was a similar development. The process began in the 19th century Tanzimat, as the Ottomans, heavily influenced by the Code Napoleon, reconstructed public life, most notably making all citizens, Muslim and non-Muslim, equal before the law. The process has continued with a vengeance from the 1920s in Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's Turkish Republic. The abolition of the Caliphate in 1924 was followed by the abolition of the Sheikh al-Islam, the Islamic Chief Justice, the abolition of the religious hierarchy, the replacement of Sharia law by European legal codes, which amongst other things brought an end to polygamy, Islamic divorce, and the introduction of civil marriage. The madrasas were closed, which meant the end of education in the formal knowledge of Islam. The Sufi lodges were closed, which meant the end of training in the spiritual understandings of Islam. Government took control of all religious endowments. In the same way, it took control of over 70,000 mosques. Individuals were pressed into Western dress, as opposed to more modest Islamic dress. They were told to abandon the Islamic calendar in favor of the Western one. They were literally instructed by Ataturk to give up their cursive Islamic script in favor of the Roman script. The fabric of an Islamic society, built up over hundreds of years, was reduced to tatters. What took place in British South Asia and in Turkey was replicated in most other Muslim societies, in Indonesia under the Dutch, in the Caucasus and Central Asia under Russia and the Soviet Union, in Iran under the Pahlavis, and in the European rule of North Africa. There is just one notable exception to this, and that is northern Nigeria. Here, the British, as always short of resources, rested their rule on the Hausa chiefs of this Islamic society. In consequence, Sharia law was sustained by the state as well as Islamic education. Leaving northern Nigeria to one side, the completeness of the change brought about by the presence of the West, its overwhelming nature, the way in which many of the structures on which an Islamic society might depend have been rubbed out, is summarized by the poet Akbar Ilahabadi, writing in India in the late 19th century. He declares, "They hold the throne in their hand. The whole realm is in their hand. The country, the apportioning of men's livelihood is in their hand. The springs of hope and fear are in their hand. In their hand is the power to decide who shall be humbled and who exalted. Our people is in their hand. Education is in their hand. If the West continues to be what it is, and the East what it is, we shall see the day when the whole world is in their hand." And then he makes the point even more strongly thus: "The minstrel and the music and the melody have all changed. Our very sleep has changed. The tale we used to hear is no longer told. Spring comes with new adornments. The nightingales in the garden sing a different song. Nature's every effect has undergone a revolution. Another kind of rain falls from the sky. Another kind of grain grows in the field." What I want to do is to examine Muslim responses to this shattering change. In particular, I want to examine their responses to the degrading or the destruction of what we might term the infrastructure of an Islamic society. We should note that these responses were informed, for the most part, by the great movement of revival and reform in the Muslim world, which began to gather way in the 16th and 17th centuries and spread throughout it in the 18th and 19th centuries. It had bases in the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah of Damascus, in Ibrahim al-Qurani's school of Hadith in Medina, and subsequently in the ideas of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. It also had bases in the thinking of Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi in South Asia and his spiritual successors in the Nakshmandia Mujahidi line, not least amongst them Shah Waliullah of Delhi and his family. Prime features of this movement were an emphasis on direct engagement with the Quran and Hadith, often circumventing the great weight of medieval scholarship, an assault on Sufi practices, in particular those which suggested that Sufi saints might intercede for man with God, and bound up with this, an attack on Ibn Arabi's concept of the unity of being. These ideas spread through the Muslim world along the connections of ulama and Sufis. Recently, the Indonesian scholar Asyumadi Azra has traced these connections in detail as they reach from West Asia into North and West Africa, and as also they move into Central, South and Southeast Asia to China. I like to think of these connections as the arteries and veins of the Muslim world, along which the life-giving force of Islamic knowledge traveled. I shall begin by looking at the Muslim responses in South Asia. There are good reasons for this. South Asian Muslims had arguably the largest and deepest interactions with the West. As a consequence, they were particularly productive in generating new ideas and new organizations to sustain them. Representing 1/3 of the Muslim peoples of the world, they have been the most effective transmitters of these new ideas and organizations to the world beyond South Asia. At the center of South Asian Muslim responses was what has been called the emergence of a willed or Protestant Islam, or a form of Islam which Marshall Hodgson termed Sharia-minded. At the heart of this process were the ulama of the madrasa founded in the Kasbah of Deoband, some 90 miles northeast of Delhi in 1867. They were assisted by other groups of reforming ulama who took more extreme jurisprudential positions than the Deobandis and were less widely followed, the Ahl Hadith and the Ahl Quran. These reformers developed a new emphasis in piety. Believers were encouraged to engage directly with scripture, which was translated into Urdu and other Indian languages. At the same time, any idea of intercession for man with God at a saint's tomb, or through angels, or through the imams, was rejected out of hand. Muslims in this tradition were reminded of the horrors of the Day of Judgment, as Ashraf Ali Tanwi did in his Behishti Zewa, his famous handbook for women, the prescriptions of which apply equally to men. Such Muslims were required to reflect every day on whether they had done enough to follow God's guidance, to meet his high standards. The reformist God was certainly compassionate and merciful, as he'd always been, but he was also to be feared. Fear God was the first practice sentence that women in the reformist tradition confronted as they were learning to read. Such Muslims were always agonizing over whether they had done enough to be saved. Out of this newly fashioned piety, there grew a heightened sense of personal responsibility towards living a good Muslim life, and in the process, helping to fashion an Islamic society. So in the absence of Muslim political power, the individual Muslim conscience was being shaped into the foundation on which an Islamic society would rest. This process also came to fashion an activist piety, in which Muslims knew they had to act on earth in the light of God's guidance if they were to be saved. The reformists not only fashioned a new form of piety, they also fashioned new means of supporting it and of transmitting it. At the center of this process was the Deoband Madrasa. It depended entirely on subscriptions from the people. It rejected all subsidies from government. The ulama were now rooted, as never before, in society. They founded new madrasas in their tradition. By 1900, there were well over 30. They gave religious guidance to the community in the form of fatwa, opinions on points of law. Muslims were encouraged to write from all over South Asia with their questions, and the Deoband Fatwa Office would send out answers through the Imperial Postal Service. Deoband is set to the work of translating the Quran, Hadith, and books in the classical Islamic tradition into Urdu and other vernacular languages. They wrote books which reinforced their reformist understandings, biographies, collective biographies, pamphlets on contested issues, as well as comprehensive guides to reformist behavior. South Asian Muslims had avoided print until the 19th century, but now everything was published large scale to reach the widest possible market at the cheapest possible price. Deoband was a town of printing presses and bookshops. So too was the old Nawabi capital of Lucknow, where, as Ulrika Stark has shown, Islamic publishing was very big business. These ulama stood up for their faith, engaging in set-piece debates with Christian missionaries and Hindu revivalists. Moreover, as they spread into the Kasbahs and local communities of South Asia, they preached their reformist vision in local mosques and illustrated what it meant by the way in which they themselves behaved. At this point, we should note that although the tide was with them, the reformists were not the only producers of religious leadership at this moment of Western dominance. There were the Barelvis, the followers of Ahmad Reza Khan of Bareilly. They believed in intercession at saint shrines and followed many other practices which the reformists condemned. Theirs was a religious practice which embraced the deeply entrenched Sufi traditions of the South Asian world. They too began to found madrasas and produce literature and leadership. So too did a totally new sect, the Ahmadiyya, who emerged from a cauldron of economic change and religious competition in the late 19th century Punjab. Their leader, Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, claimed that he was the messiah of the Christian and Muslim traditions, as well as being an avatar of Krishna. Apart from this, his beliefs were not very different from those of the reformists, except he claimed the power of prophecy. This made him anathema to most Muslims, but he gained followers who were renowned for their missionary work, and still are. Having introduced you to the early attempts of South Asian Muslims to rebuild their society from below through the work of madrasas and through reaching out directly to society, let me now demonstrate what happened to this initiative as the 20th century developed. In one sentence, the numbers of madrasas exploded. During the first half of the 20th century, their number would have been less than 1,000. By the end of the century, there were 80,000, perhaps many more. Accurate numbers are hard to establish. Sometimes madrasas have resisted registration, at others, maktabs or primary schools have been registered which would not produce fully fledged ulama. Nevertheless, although we cannot be precise about numbers, we can be sure that they have vastly increased and well out of proportion to the increase in population. Let us consider this process in slightly greater detail. In Pakistan, at independence, there were just 189 madrasas. By 2002, there were at least 10,000, of which 7,000 were Deobandi and 1,600 were Barelvi. The reasons for their growth were several. Poor Pakistani families found madrasas, which had offered not just education, but board for their sons, most attractive. The state, which spent 3 times on defense what it spent on education, failed to provide satisfactory public education at the local level. To these factors should be added Saudi and Gulf funding for madrasas, an enabling environment under the Islamizing regime of General Zia-ul-Haq, the use made by both Pakistan and the West of madrasas and their human materials to resist the invasion of Afghanistan, and the growing value they had from the 1980s as pools of supporters for those engaged in Pakistan's increasingly sectarian politics. Many were the forces driving the growth of madrasas. But before we leave Pakistan, we should note one particular outcome of Deobandi activism. This is the work of their madrasas in creating a Sunni infrastructure in eastern Iran. Stéphane Doudoignon of the CNRS in Paris has recently demonstrated how the Deobandis spread from Karachi into Iranian Baluchistan, making the Jamia Darul Uloom Zahedan a great center of scholarship. From here, with the support of both the Pahlavi and the revolutionary regime, they spread their madrasas through the region and into Sistan, Khorasan, and Central Asia. Under Khomeini, they were given permission to run their own Sharia courts. It would appear that the central government in Tehran preferred to deal with law-abiding Sunni ulama as regional representatives, rather than with their fractious tribal leaders. The outcome was the further spread of the infrastructure of a Sunni Islamic society. In Bangladesh, madrasas have always been part of the state provision. There are 2 main types, the Alia madrasas, which are state-funded, and teach secular subjects alongside the Quran and Hadith, and the Qawmi madrasas, modelled after the Deobandi pattern, and therefore privately funded and focusing on a religious curriculum. Between 1972 and 2002, the Alia madrasas grew from about 1,500 to well over 8,000, and the Qawmi madrasas from 1,500 to nearly 12,000. Amongst the reasons for this development were the failure of the state, as in Pakistan, to provide effective education to the lowest levels of society, the enabling atmosphere created by the Islamizing regime of General Zia al-Rahman, as he sought legitimacy after overthrowing the founders of Bangladesh, the remittances of Bangladesh's migrant workers as they sought respectability in their villages by supporting religious education, and the work of large numbers of Islamic NGOs. As in Pakistan, some madrasas and their ulama organizations became caught up in politics. For instance, on the borders of Chittagong, madrasas on the borders of Chittagong became involved in Rohingya militancy. In India, it would appear that the number of madrasas have risen from a few hundred at independence to over 40,000 at the beginning of this century. In explaining this, we need to remember the poverty of Indian Muslims, who are for the most part an oppressed minority. As in Pakistan and Bangladesh, madrasas make up for the failure of the state education system. There are said to be 30 million school-aged children out of school. But for Muslims, by preserving Urdu and Muslim manners as they teach the classical madrasa subjects, madrasas also preserve identity. Indian ulama steer well clear of politics, although right-wing Hindu politicians have not been slow to draw their madrasas into politics for their own purpose. One of the elements of an Islamic society which the madrasa world of India has supported is the Imarati Sharia organization of the states of Bihar, Jharkhand, and Orissa. Founded in 1921, in the midst of the Khilafat non-cooperation movement against the British, it established a separate legal structure outside the framework of the state to administer Islamic law. This has survived down to the present, administering Islamic personal law. The organization arbitrates between litigants as a traditional qadi might have done. It has no power to enforce outcomes, depending on the faith of those concerned and perhaps social pressure for enforcement. But it is a not inconsiderable organization which so far the Indian state has permitted to exist. So the number of madrasas in South Asia has grown substantially. In principle, this has meant a significant increase in those able to support the infrastructure of an Islamic society. How much weight we should give to this, it is difficult to say. The numbers of madrasas only give an indication of the possible numbers of madrasa students, which might vary from under 100 per institution to over 3,000 or more. Equally, we do not know how many students persist to the end of their course and emerge as fully fledged ulama. Nevertheless, we can be sure that the numbers of those able to play a part in sustaining an Islamic society have increased substantially. This said, the foundation of madrasas and the education of increasing numbers of ulama were not the only means of building an Islamic society from below. There were also movements designed to fashion correct behavior and sustain piety in society at large. One of these was the Tablighi Jamaat, or preaching society, which focused on reforming the individual, and by this means, by reforming society at large. It was founded in 1927 by a Deobandi scholar, Muhammad Ilyas, who wished to rescue Muslims who Hindus had recently converted to Hinduism. Out of this, there grew a vigorous Muslim missionary movement to Muslims at large. The basic aim was to call Muslims to improve their Islamic standards. Followers, who paid their own expenses, formed themselves into groups of 10, Jamaats they were called. They then went to a specific area, and by what they preached and how they dressed and how they behaved, called their fellow Muslims to Islam. All was modelled on the example of the Prophet Muhammad. Tablighis agreed to give a day a week, a weekend every month, or 40 days a year to the cause of preaching. They are now said to form, although no one can be sure, as membership records do not exist, the most widely followed Muslim movement in Islam, with 100 to 150 million followers. Its annual gatherings, which are said to be sources of great blessings to attendees, attract vast numbers. Over 1 million at Bhopal in India, over 1.5 million at Raiwind in Pakistan, and over 3 million at Tongi in Bangladesh. The movement, moreover, attracts support from all classes. In Pakistan, for instance, from leading generals and politicians down to humble apprentices. There are other Islamic movements, for instance, the Jamaat-e-Islami, founded by the journalist and Islamic thinker Maulana Maududi. This organization was to fashion an elite vanguard of the pure to transform Islamic society from within. Its branches in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh have relatively few members. Prospective members have to pass vigorous tests to belong, but it does have millions of sympathizers, particularly amongst the university educated. Having initially taken a conservative approach towards women's activism, the Jamaat now embraces their support. It runs separate women's organizations, women's reading groups, and even publishes romantic novels with Islamic messages. Its prime concern is to use the power of the state to press forward its Islamic purpose, and it recognizes that women have votes equally with men. Yet another movement is Farhad Hashmi's Al-Huda organization, which has gained considerable purchase amongst middle and upper class women in Pakistan. Hashmi, an Arabic scholar who comes out of an Hadith background, is not popular with the ulama. They do not like a woman taking the lead in religious teaching. They're also unhappy about the privileged background of most Al-Huda members. I hope it's now clear how, in South Asia, under colonial rule, and under the independent regimes that followed, Muslims, for the most part without political power, have taken control of the business of fashioning an Islamic society. Direct knowledge of scripture, working with the individual human conscience, was the basis. Tens of thousands of madrasas, funded by popular subscription, have helped supply the infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of students with various levels of learning have poured out of these schools to act as a leaven, particularly at the lower levels of society. The printing press has made vast numbers of Islamic works available in vernacular languages and in cheap format. The work of preaching has been carried forward with great vigor by ordinary men and now increasingly by women. These developments have, of course, had an impact on public life. In some cases, madrasas have been the supporters of sectarian movements and indeed Islamic militancy. The Jamaat-e-Islami has achieved positions of influence and occasionally been a member of governing coalitions in both Pakistan and Bangladesh. Islamic vocabulary has increasingly become part of the political discourse. Political scientists will rightly point out that there are many factors, both political and geopolitical, behind the Islamization of the politics of Pakistan and Bangladesh since the 1970s. But I have no doubt that part of the explanation lies in the construction of Islamic societies from below that I've set out. The same processes have been at work in India, but the situation of Indian Muslims as a relatively small and oppressed minority has meant that their expression has been different. Let us now turn to Turkey. You'll recall that under Ataturk, much of the infrastructure of Islam was expunged from society. Yet, as in South Asia, Turkey has seen a remarkable rebuilding of its Islamic infrastructure from below. In this case, the process owed nothing to the ulama. They'd been destroyed by Ataturk. It was the work of Sufis who survived Ataturk and the private piety of millions of individuals. As it happens, the initial spark for this process came from South Asia. The most important Sufi order in terms of building an Islamic society in the 20th century has been the Nakshmandia. In the early 17th century, the Nakshmandia in India had experienced an important renewal under Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi, whom I mentioned to you earlier. His specific ideas were worked out in his resistance to the religious eclecticism of the Mughal emperors Akbar and Jahangir. They were contained in his Maktubat, his collected letters written to the Mughals and their courtiers. Specifically, they supported his beliefs in the unity of God against various forms of heterodoxy. He was given the title of Mujaddid, or renewer of the second millennium of Islam. The Naqshbandi line that flows from him is known as the Mujaddidi. In the 19th century, Sirhindi's Mujaddidi tradition inspired Maulana Khalid of Baghdad, first to come to India to learn from Sirhindi's successors in Delhi, and then to found his own formation of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi, the Khalidiyya. This was focused on the renewal of Islam and resistance to Western economic and political penetration. It had followers throughout the Caucasus, Anatolia, the Crimea, and Istanbul. In the order, Sirhindi's Maktubat remained a central work of guidance. All the Naqshbandi manifestations of 20th century Turkey flowed from the Khalidiyya. We're credibly informed that Turgut Özal, the prime minister who liberalized the Turkish economy in the 1980s with the Naqshbandi, and that Tayyip Erdogan, the current president, is a Naqshbandi. Let me introduce you to three offshoots of the Naqshbandi Khalidiyya, which have been building Turkish Islam from below. The first is the Sulamanjas, the followers of the Naqshbandi Sheikh Suleiman Hilmi Tunahan, who lived from 1888 through to 1959. With 4 million followers, they represent the second largest Islamic movement in Turkey. Their prime concern has been to sustain a traditional Hanafi Ottoman Islamic society against both Kemalist materialism and those who wish to unite Islam to political power, Islamists. In the high Kemalist era, they would meet to read classical texts, in particular Sirhindi's Maktubat, in order to build an inner resistance to secular developments. At the same time, although harassed by the authorities, they trained men to be imams and preachers. From the mid-20th century, they increasingly operated more publicly. They worked with the Democrat government in the 1950s in establishing Imam Hatip schools, now part funded by the state, to train power leaders and preachers. From the 1980s, they focused particularly on youth, providing scholarships for university students and the largest and best equipped student dormitory network in the country. Their main supporters came from the growing and increasingly wealthy Turkish middle class, powered by the industrialization of Anatolia from the 1960s and the liberalization of the economy from the 1980s. The most powerful force in building Turkey's Islamic society from below has been the Nurcular, the followers of Said Bediüzzaman Nursi, who lived from 1876 to 1960, a Kurd from Bitlis near Lake Van in southeast Anatolia. A brilliant young man, he tried unsuccessfully to persuade the Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II to support the foundation of a university in Van to teach both modern science and Islam. He was also a supporter of the Young Turk Revolution. He had an excellent record in World War I, fighting the Russians in eastern Anatolia, and was a strong supporter of the subsequent Turkish liberation struggle. But from 1923, he separated from the Kemalist regime when he realized that Ataturk's aim was to separate the modern Turkish state and society from their Islamic heritage. He went through a major spiritual crisis. Assisted by reading Sir Hindu's Maktubat, amongst other works, he came to realize that man could only serve one master, and that was God. He left the Kemalist regime in Ankara and returned to Van for a life of contemplation, writing, and spiritual leadership. He now understood that the rejuvenation of Islamic society in Turkey must be carried out at the level of the individual. He aimed to fashion a new Turkish Islamic self, which will be reflective and which will be able to resist the destructive power of nationalism and materialism. So just as the Deobandi Muslims in India wanted to fashion the individual human conscience as the basis of an Islamic society under British rule, so he did the same for Turkish society under Kemalist rule. He was sent into internal exile and frequently imprisoned. His means of transmitting his ideas was his Risale-i-Nur, his commentary on the Quran. As people were forbidden to read his writings, they could not be printed. Instead, they were copied by hand and delivered through much of Turkish society. It's said that as many as 600,000 copies were made of his Risale. From the 1960s, Nursi's followers would come together in dershanis, a special apartment or single-floor building in which they would read out loud passages from Nursi's writings and discuss them. The readings would involve a continuous process of interpretation in relation to contemporary issues and events. The makeup of groups would depend on the locality in which the dershani was placed, but typically they might include small businessmen, lawyers, teachers, and students. Discussion would normally be led by laymen. Government-paid religious functionaries were not taken seriously. In this environment, there was a club-like atmosphere. Businessmen might do business. But the weekly dershane session had the impact of fostering a shared Islamic worldview and a heightened community consciousness. In the light of the business support, it's not surprising that from the 1980s, the Nurjus consistently defended Turgut Özal's liberalizing policies and the withdrawal of the state from the educational and economic spheres. By the 21st century, the Nurjus had 5 million followers, 5,500 dershanis. They had the largest number of educated supporters in Turkey and also the strongest support amongst young people. To add to this, they developed major positions in publishing and in the religious media. The third Nakshbandi offshoot, which in fact is a branch of the Nurju movement, is that of Fazlullah Gulen, born in 1941, known as the Community of Fazlullah Gulen. It is said to be the most influential movement in contemporary Turkey. Coming from a village near Erzurum, close to Turkey's borderlands with Russia, Gulen grew up regarding Islam and the state as the protectors of his world. The son of a religious functionary, he went to work for the Directorate of Religious Affairs. By the mid-1960s, he'd come to develop his vision for enabling Islam to work as a leaven in Turkish society. To put this into practice, he aimed not to create a new class of ulama, but a new class of intellectuals, rooted in the Turkish Islamic tradition, but also able to engage with European Enlightenment thought. These intellectuals, moreover, were not to be the inwardly turned Islamic self-fashioners of Sayyid Nursi, but Muslims of action, Muslims who would realize their faith by action in this world. Gulen's constant theme has been action. He invokes three mobilizing concepts. Hizmet, rendering service to religion and state. Himmet, giving donations and protecting good work. And ilhas, seeking God's appreciation of every action. Like the Suleymanjis and the Nurjus, Gulen supporters came from the increasingly large and wealthy Turkish middle class. Alongside the businessmen and teachers, there were growing numbers of journalists. Gulen benefited greatly from the support of Prime Minister Turgut Özal, who saw value in the fact that Gulen was both a nationalist Muslim, but had no desire to link Islam to the state. Özal's liberalizing of the Turkish system enabled Gulen's move into the media, his establishment of the national newspaper, Zaman, and the national television channel, Samanyolu. It also enabled him to establish business associations and, most of all, educational institutions. Education was at the heart of his mission. This was the way an activist Islamic piety was to be established. As it was not possible to teach religion outside the Imam Hatip schools, Gulen's followers taught Islam by conduct. His educational network, in which this takes place, in 2016, supported 6,000 teachers, 200 high schools, and 80 university preparatory schools, and 7 universities in Turkey and Turkic Central Asia. English is the primary language in the classroom, and his students are notably successful in getting into universities. These formal institutions are supported by a widespread informal network of dershanes, where college students provide religious, educational, and social support to their peers. Such has been Gulen's success that governments have become concerned about the size of his organization within the state. In consequence, even though he defended the military crackdown after the soft coup of 1997, the military regime moved against him, and he was forced into exile in the United States. In 2015, Tayyip Erdogan, whose Justice and Development Party Gulen had supported throughout the 21st century, decided that Gulen's followers had too strong a position in the police and judiciary, and began a witch hunt against them. After the attempted coup of July 2016, Erdogan tried to wipe out all manifestations of the Gulen movement in Turkish society. We do not know at the moment how much of his educational structures have survived. So the Turks have built a major Islamic presence in civil society, in spite of Ataturk, and in spite of the Kemalist military regimes which succeeded him. It is a presence which had nothing to do with the administration of the Sharia, which was abolished by Ataturk, although it does have something to do with Islamically trained functionaries. The numbers being trained in Imam Hatip schools rose from about 220,000 in 1983 to 511,000 in 1997. On the other hand, it is a presence which has all to do with the internalization of Islamic values by ordinary citizens and their expression in social action. A measure of its weight in Turkish society is the way in which Tayyip Erdogan's Islamically rooted Justice and Development Party has been able since 2002 to keep the Kemalists and the army on the margins of politics. Another measure of a slightly different kind is the way in which Erdogan was able to offer Arab states during the Arab Spring the model of Turkey as a secular state ruled by an Islamically rooted party. As I indicated at the beginning of this lecture, the processes we can see taking place in South Asia and in Turkey can also be seen at work elsewhere in the Muslim world, although of course always subject to the pressures of local contexts. Indonesia, under Dutch rule, saw a similar development of madrasas and Islamic organization to that in South Asia. From 1912, they developed the Muhammadiyya, an organization stimulated by the general process of Islamic reform and expressing an Islamic piety very similar to that of Deoband. Now it supports nearly 6,000 schools and has 29 million members. In opposition to the Ahmadiyya, a second group, the Nahdlatul Ulama, was founded in 1926. Its views were very close to India's Barelwis. Now, operating outside the framework of the state, it claims to have nearly 7,000 schools, to own 44 universities, and to have 50 million members. In the 1980s, as General Suharto began to demilitarize his new order dictatorship, he began to court the huge Islamic presence in Indonesia's civil society. He promoted Islamic values, supporting the development of a code of Islamic law, the founding of an Islamic bank, and lifting the ban on the veil in schools and government offices. He went on Hajj, changing his name to Haji Muhammad Suharto. Whereas at the beginning of his reign, Suharto felt able to ignore Muslim sensitivities, the sheer presence of Islam in civil society meant that as time went on, he had to pay it increasing attention. Egypt offers another example of Islamization from below. Here leadership came not from the ulama, who were government employees, but from Muslim intellectuals. In the context of British rule in 1928, Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood to instill the Quran and the Sunnah as a sole reference point for ordering the life of the Muslim family, community, and state. His aim was to drive Western influence from Egypt. And this has been the aim of the Brotherhood, influenced by the ideas of the South Asian Maulana Maududi from the 1950s down to the present. Primarily funded by tithes from its members, for its work in supporting poor Egyptians, it won widespread support amongst students and the middle classes, as well as the working classes. Measures of its support in Egyptian society are, for instance, Egypt's referendum of 1981, which voted to make the Sharia the sole source of law, and the elections of the Arab Spring, which saw the Muslim Brotherhood's political wing become by far the largest party in the Egyptian parliament, and the election of the unfortunate Mohamed Morsi as Egypt's president in 1912. As we know, the Egyptian military have overturned these results, but what they say about how Egyptians have built their Islamic society from below remains unchanged. The capacities developed in building Islamic societies from below over the past 200 years have meant that Islam has been particularly well equipped to establish itself in new regions where the state is either neutral or hostile. Most of the notable organizations covered in this lecture have spread Islamic communities into Europe and North America. In Europe, when 2014, roughly 44 million, there were 44 million Muslims, the Muslim Brotherhood and all the South Asian organizations are significantly present. In North America, a particular prize goes to the controversial Ahmadiyya community, for being the first American Muslim community and building in Detroit the first purpose-built mosque in the United States. Turkish Gulen community has been active in establishing charter schools. Not a penny, to my knowledge, has been taken from the state, although the odd Muslim ruler has taken a hand. Saddam Hussein supplying a mosque in Birmingham, England, and the Saudis many, many school books. I've tried to give you a picture of how, over the past 200 years, Muslim societies without Muslim political power have built Islamic societies from below. Of course, Muslims have always contributed to the Islamic infrastructure of their societies, but the loss of power made it crucially important that they did so. The achievement of the past 2 centuries has often involved turning inwards to fashion the self, to develop the individual conscience as a basis of the Muslim society. Moreover, as time has gone on, there's been the requirement that this self should be an activist self. The achievement has also involved massive projects in education at all levels. A willingness to embrace new technology, in particular print, has driven the process forward. So too has the willingness of millions of individual Muslims to invest their resources of time and money There have been many acts of courage as individual Muslims have faced imprisonment, torture, or death at the hands of secular and usually dictatorial regimes. The fashioning of Islamic societies from below has been a profound achievement of piety, of humility, most of the time, and of selfless social service. Thank you.
Thank you so much for what Professor Robinson's intervention was absolutely inspired. It was wide-ranging in method as well as in regional and temporal markers. At this point, I will be inviting everyone present here from the audience to ask questions, which you can do through the chat box option as well as through the microphone. But before I do, I can't help but ask a question myself, which I admit I don't know much about. But I've been reading Syed Amr Ali's An Introduction to the Saracens, which I believe was published in 1899. And Amr Ali, I mean, as we all know, is not exactly a figure who is really a favorite of any ulama or a clergy member at that point of time because of an allegation of too much Western influence, but he was practicing law in London. So, but there was this one line where he mentions the South Asian Muslims should take note from what he believes to be the nimble wit of the Slavs. So in that line, I was kind of wondering what were the ramifications, if any exist at all, of possible South Asian Muslim networks vis-a-vis East European networks that, against maybe what we can call a 20th century continental European dominated strand.
Well, I can't, could you just repeat the question briefly?
Absolutely. I was wondering, so Syed Amr Ali, basically, he kind of correlates this phrase, the nimble wit of the Slavs, of the Slavic race, to what he believes that the South Asian Muslim community should kind of take note of. So I was wondering, and again, I do not know if there is any basis for this question. It's just something I was thinking. What were the ramifications, if there were any at all, of possible South Asian Muslim networks in the 20th century vis-a-vis East European networks against what we might call a continentally European dominated strand? Because I think you mentioned at some point, you say Protestant Islam, you bring in that category. So that's kind of where I was thinking about all of it.
Okay, well, I think the spread of South Asian Islamic organizations throughout the world is a very interesting development and one that has not really been properly studied. Its immediate significance is that, of course, they have established communities following their own particular doctrines wherever they've gone. So, for instance, we have Barelvis and Deobandis in Britain. There are lots of Ahmadiyya in West Africa. You can find Muslim communities following different South Asian dispensations throughout North America. So one development is, I suppose, a globalization of South Asian understandings of Islam, different South Asian understandings of Islam. And of course, some of these communities recruit non-South Asians to their membership. So, if you like, you could regard it as a form of South Asian soft power, although we haven't seen it used considerably in terms of power yet, but it is a considerable development.
Thank you so much, sir. I'll be thinking about those lines. Now, the floor is open to questions from the faculty as well as the audience and anyone else who may have any questions.
Actually, Professor Amit raised his hand. Professor Amit, sir. Yeah, thank you, Professor Robinson, for a fascinating discussion and a very good evening from Kolkata. And thank you, Presidency University, for organizing such an important lecture. My query is very specific. Uh, that is whether the folk singers in the Islamic world played a significant role from below to popularize Islam or to contribute to the formation of Islamic identity. That is my specific query. Would you say that they also played a significant role? But that is the paradox is that they were attacked by the representatives of hegemonic orthodoxy.
Now, are you talking about the Amit? First of all, hello, Amit.
Hello, hello.
Uh, are you talking about the balls?
Yeah, sir. Yeah, Professor Robinson. Yeah.
Okay, right. Well, any cultural form which, if you like, transmits forms of Islamic ideas also bolsters Muslim identity. So the whole Bhakti movement has been hugely important in this, although not necessarily involved with an Islamic identity. But no, the adding, if you like, forms of art to ideas as throughout the history of religions is recognized as a powerful way of transmitting ideas. So the answer is yes.
Thank you, Professor Robinson. Thank you. And stay safe and stay well.
Now I may request the Sambit Rai Chaudhary.
Uh, Thank you, Professor Robinson, for this wonderful talk. This is Shombit, student of history from PG2. Sir, you said that Tablighi Jamaat, initially a North Indian affair, was formed to rescue Muslims who converted to Hinduism. Being initially a North Indian affair, do you think it was also a reaction against Arya Samaj, who was practicing Shuddhi at that point of time?
Okay. Yes, you're quite right that the Tabligh is founded initially to respond to the Shuddhi initiatives of the Hindus. But it quite quickly develops, it evolves into an organization that's not just concerned with resisting a Hindu conversion movement. So you're quite right in the way that it starts in Mewat with that purpose, but then grows into something else. Okay.
Okay. Then the some Fahim.
Thank you so much. This is Sumaira Noreen, in fact. My ID is with the name of Sam Fahim. First of all, I would really like to thank Professor Robinson. It is always more than a delight and enlightenment to listen to Professor Robinson. As rightly mentioned, madrasas have preserved identity, but in the name of creating spirit of common national identity, the government of Pakistan intends to bring all styles of existing curricula into line with what they propose, a single national curriculum. So there is a question, like in Professor Francis Robinson's opinion, what should be the response of madrasas towards the intended, rather proposed single national curriculum of Pakistan government?
Well, what I'd say is the government can propose, but the ulama will probably dispose. They'll find a way of resisting that because I'm sure that, in fact, some sort of compromise can be achieved between the government's concern to move to a national curriculum and the ulama's desire to teach an Islamic curriculum.
Yeah, and the same might apply to the Cambridge system as well, which still works in Pakistan in the form of A levels and O levels exams, and maybe the new system which is emerging now in the name of IB, which is International Baccalaureate System. So there is a plethora of systems which exist in Pakistan, and I really wonder how would we be able to bring everything along a single national curriculum design in Pakistan.
Well, I think it'd be a massive achievement to be able to do that, because there are massive obstacles in the way. And
yeah, I'm still confused about this whole phenomena, this whole ideology of bringing everything into line with within a single paradigm. I think it's not practical in the given circumstances.
You know about education in Pakistan, Samaria, so you'll have a stronger sense than I will of what is actually feasible and what is not. But what I do know is that the ulama will find every possible way to resist that.
Yeah, and I think last but not the least, I must say thanks to you for all this encouragement that I find for sharing my analysis about things. Thanks again, Professor Francis Robinson.
Thank you, ma'am. May I request to the Fakhr Bilal, who raised hand.
Thank you very much, and very good evening from Islamabad, Professor Francis Robinson. And very delight, as Sumera said, good to see you and learn from you every time as my own PhD and the duration. I have two questions. First one is, as you spoke about Bangladesh and Jamaat-e-Islami in both ways, in Pakistan and Bangladesh. So how do you see the future of Jamaat-e-Islami in both countries? And the second thing about the case is that how do you see the division of Deobandis that is happening right now in Pakistan, that recently 2-3 Deobandi Madaris, they have went against the Wafakul Madaris and they have started their own new small education board, which is happening with Rashid and Jamia Banoria, Jamia Rashidia and Jamia Banoria in Karachi. So I would like to have your insight, the future of Deobandism or Deobandi Islam in Pakistan and future of Jamaat-e-Islami in Bangladesh and Pakistan both. And thank you very much to the organizers, those who gave this wonderful opportunity to listen to Professor Robinson.
Those are two big questions. As far as the Jamaat is concerned, I think much depends upon how flexible it's prepared to be. As you probably know, it didn't really encourage women for a long time. But over the past 20 or 30 years, it has begun to embrace women, and women have become a very important part of its organization. So I think one response, both for Bangladesh and for Pakistan, depends on how flexible the Jamaat is prepared to be. Because it's very choosy about who it permits to become a full member, it may actually have to become a little less choosy about those who it permits to become members. But so flexibility is, I think, the most important thing. And the kind of flexibility, for instance, which in Bangladesh encouraged the Jamaat to write romantic novels with Islamic messages to encourage women to become part of its organization. Now, you mentioned a Deobandi split. Can you tell me a bit more about this split in Pakistan amongst Deobandis?
This split is very recent. Recently, Jamia Banoria and Jamia Rashid in Karachi, they declared that they are no more going with Wafakul Madaris Multan or the Deobandi Education Board. And that again has the reason because two of these madrasas, they are looking for their graduates to go for more and more jobs in the government and having the patronage of the Pakistan Army to support them in financing or few more things. So they have went for creating their own Majmaul Islam as a new education board, and they declared it just a month back. And this is something that is now going to create a big division between the Deobandis, those who are going for traditional way, and the people from the Benoria and the Rashidia or Rashid itself, that they are looking for going for the state services, the army or the military services, the commissioned in the forces, the civil services, or the SEAL servants of Pakistan. So this divide just has now bringing a new gulf between the same traditional Deobandi spectrum. And that is what I just want to have your opinion, that how this mundane or worldly affair, as well as the traditional strict madrasa training, that has to go hand in hand according to Deobandi Islam, or the version of Deobandi Islam.
Well, I think we need, I'm sorry, I'm rather dodging your question, but I think we actually need more information before we can begin to produce any sensible response. Has the government, for instance, been involved in encouraging this division? Are there particular rivalries that have existed for a long time which have created this division, and so on?
This is DGISPR, Director General Inter-Services or Intelligence Services and Public Relation, that has recently gave the certificates and encouragement and things which went for Jamia Rashidia, and then the same is the case now. The Benoria people, they came to the forefront while supporting them. And this is something which is now bringing this divide among the traditionalism, that people, those who used to think that madrasa training was more for the religion, more for the service of masjid, maktab, madrasa. And now this is something which is bringing people to learn that they need to go for state service. They need to have had the better livelihood. They need to get commissioned in the forces. They need to have commission in the civil services. So that is something which is now the Deobandis in Pakistan. They are now having these two fronts. And therefore they declared their joining, that they are no more with Wafaqul Madaris, and they have started their very new education board, that is Majmua Talimul Islam, and they are now preparing their own curriculum.
Right. I just add one comment. I mean, the Deobandi network, as you have demonstrated in Pakistan, is a very considerable organization. And it's not surprising that there will be perhaps competition amongst different leading Deobandis to control it. And that kind of competition often leads to the kind of divisions that you've been talking about.
Now I'm a request to my senior colleague, Professor Mridu Rai. Yes. Mridu, are you here?
Yeah, sorry about that. Professor Robinson, thank you very much, of course, as expected, a wonderful lecture. I have a question that sort of, would like to engage you a little on, just the reference point, really, the Islamic Societies from below bit. And I was wondering where, in that context, one places movements like, the Pasmanda Muslim movements. After all, those who challenge using the language of caste, in fact, who see actually Muslim communities as really being dominated by the Ashraf. How do those tensions really play out? Because what I like about the thread that you've drawn across the world is really sort of the loss of political power that places the obligation on Muslims to be individually but also actively pious. But in some ways, some of those the groups that you're talking about also seem to sort of flow in naturally into another kind of dominant identity, that of the Ashraf. And so I was wondering if there's anything to be said about the tensions that arise because they themselves in turn can turn into dominant groups vis-a-vis disciplining other Muslims and telling them how they must be Muslims.
I think one of the striking things of the development of this huge number of madrasas is that most of the people who've been going to them come from the poorer or poorest sections of Muslim society. One of the attractions of sending your child or your children to a madrasa is, as I said in the lecture, is that you get free board and lodging. Another attraction is that you probably gain a little bit in prestige in your village when it's known that your son or sons are the bearers of religious knowledge. I think it's quite interesting to see how this plays out in terms of Sharif dominance, because I would expect Sharif dominance actually increasingly to be resisted. But how that plays out would turn entirely upon the local circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I was thinking of my friend Khalid Anis Ansari, for instance, has done fantastic work on how, within, I mean, we're not even talking about the high, Ashraf, urban Ashraf, but within village communities, how members of the quote-unquote lower caste Muslims, I mean, I know we're not, technically they don't exist as caste groups, but how, they're not permitted to worship in the same mosques, for instance, and their mosques are being destroyed, even though they may, sort of come out of the same madaris. Still, I mean, there is, I mean, I suppose at one level it's a question of really, relative material power. I mean, these are at the end of the day the lowest amongst Muslim communities. But Khalid Ansari talks about sort of a denial of the Ashraf, and as you said, actually, an insistence by the Pasmanda that they are in fact oppressed by the Ashraf, and all of this can come out of the same mix of the same madrasas and so on and so forth. But thank you.
So that was a statement, not a question.
I was just trying to sort of clarify what I tried to ask as a question, perhaps didn't ask as clearly as I should have. But thank you.
So, if you allow a few more questions, then I request to the Ahmad Baloch for his queries. Francis, sir, would you allow to a few more questions?
Yeah, sure.
So then I request to the Ahmad Baloch.
Thank you, sir. This is my identity. Actually, I am Professor Rukhsana from Punjab University. I am also the student.
Sorry, ma'am.
I am also. It's okay. It's okay. I'm also the student of Francis. I have good time in 2011 and 12. Thank you, Professor Francis Robinson. It has always been a delight for us just to enlighten us with such a wonderful lecture. I have a little query about South Asian Islam and the traditional society. Actually, South Asian Islam is transforming and getting more and more complicated day by day. My little query is this, that according to my opinion, that Islam, whenever interpreted in these societies, it always created conflict. As one of our colleagues asked about the curriculum in Pakistan and the shades of curriculum in Pakistan, Fakhar Bilal identified the split in different sects in Pakistan. Do you think so? Islam is creating unity, or Islam is creating conflict in present scenario? Thank you.
Well, first I would say is that Islam doesn't create unities or conflicts. It's people who create unities and conflicts. frankly, in human societies, there are always going to be forms of conflict. And people will use those ideological resources that they have to hand to rationalize what they do. So I don't think you can say Islam does this or Islam does that. You can say that people use the ideas available to them, of which Islam provides one set, in order to support the ways forward or the actions that they wish to adopt.
Now, Wahuddin Ahmad is also raised his hand. Wahuddin Ahmad, are you available? Not at all. Perhaps he is not there. Then the another one is the Zaygam Sarfaraz. Please unmute your mic. Zaygam bhai is not audible. Please unmute your. Now it's unmuted.
Yeah, no. Thank you for giving me the chance, and it's always been a pleasure. I'm right now working with Francis on the Braille movement in Pakistan. So, just a comment and a response answer to the Fakhr's question that it's not only a Deobandis networking being divided into many parts. The government has initiated a huge program for dividing all the networks. It seems like it goes with the Brailleys, Aliatis, Alitashi, and so on and so forth. So basically, the straight narrative is to divide and to opt for certain state-sponsored personalities or the groups in order to have their will and to penetrate their agenda within the madrasas. I am working with the Braille movement, and same goes with the Tanzim al-Madaris. The Tanzim al-Madaris has been divided into many parts. Dawat Islami has organized and initiated its own board, likewise Minajul Quran and the other Jamia Rizviya. So it's a national narrative, not only restricted to the Deobandi school of thought. That was the response for Fakhr's blog. Thank you so much.
That seemed to me to be just a statement. It didn't require an answer.
Yeah.
Then may I request to the Danish Wali?
Yeah, hello Francis sir. This is Danish Wali from Nagpur University. Well, my question is, I'm not gonna ask about Jamaats and all, because as you said, the people are the one who cause conflicts. So my question is, what do you think Islam is as an overall religion? What are your thoughts on Islam as an overall religion?
Could you just repeat that question? It's a bit difficult to hear you.
Sorry, sir. So I'm not gonna ask about Jamaats and all, because as you mentioned, that it's the people who cause the conflict, not the religion. So my question is, what are your thoughts on Islam as an overall religion?
Well, that's a very big question. What are my thoughts about Islam as a world religion?
Yeah, as a world religion. Yes.
Well, I'd say, first of all, it's been a remarkable achievement. We have, Islam is one of the three great revealed religions, along with Christianity and Judaism. And it has provided, as both Christianity and Judaism have done, ways for human beings to live good lives, to live good, ethical lives. And it's provided hundreds of millions of human beings with solace throughout time. So I'm not going to say that there's anything special we can attach to it that makes it better or worse than Christianity or Judaism. But like all the great revealed religions, it has enabled people to live good lives and also try to create working and just societies. Doesn't mean it always achieves that, because there's not a small amount of wickedness around in the world. But it does lead people towards living a good and just, creating a good and just society. One of the things that strikes me in a small way, because we've got quite a lot of Muslim students at Royal Holloway, and I'm always struck when talking to them informally by how much work of social service they do. I think they probably do a bit more than non-Muslims, but there's a strong social service element, the need to serve other people, which goes with being brought up as a Muslim. And I'm not sure if that answers you as well as you would like, but there is an answer.
No, sir, no, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your answer.
Sir Santosh Rai from the University of Delhi actually would like to how Professor Robinson will like to explain case of All India Momin Conference challenging mainstream Muslim identity.
I'll show my ignorance here. I know nothing about the way in which the All India Momin Conference has challenged Muslim identity. I can't answer it. I'm sorry.
That's right, sir. So now we have another Sohail Ramzan Rana would like to say something or have an query. Sohail.
Thank you very much. My question is if about the overall thesis of Sir Francis about that Islamic societies had been built from below since 1800s. Does it mean that they did not have any patronage whatsoever from state at any level? Was this lack of patronage or support absolute and complete? I just wanted to ask this. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Well, I prepared the way by demonstrating how the spread of European power had led to the destruction of support in almost all Muslim societies for supporting the basic fabric of an Islamic society. And the thrust of my argument, I think you clearly understood, is that this work of, if you like, recreating the basis of an Islamic society has been done by individual Muslims, or Muslims organizing themselves into organizations, and almost entirely apart from the state. And that, I think, it's a very important thing to note, that it is possible for human beings to come together and do so throughout the world in order to try and fashion the world that they think they ought to live in. So the state really, in Bangladesh, it's been involved a bit. Pakistan, it gets involved a bit. But basically, this is the achievement of individual Muslims using their faith and also their resources. And I find it a very impressive achievement.
Okay, thank you.
So, this was that no more queries. I found that everyone is satisfied his queries. And now, sir, may I request to the Bipasa for the vote of thanks for this interesting and informative lecture by the Professor Robinson, sir.
Thank you so much to Professor Robinson and to everyone who could join us today, especially our esteemed professors and our HOD, whose enthusiasm is infectious about these. I shouldn't say the word infectious lightly at this point of time, given the pandemic, but truly he's been an inspiration for organizing all of these lectures. And again, once again, thank you very much, Professor Francis Robinson, for what is, I mean, I've learned more than I probably will all week. So it's been wonderful hearing you speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a great privilege.
No, sir, it's our privilege that you have with, despite his busy schedule, you have find the time to grace this web lecture series. And thank you very much, sir, for this interesting and informative lecture. And I also thank to all my colleagues, students, friends, faculties, researchers from the other universities for joining with us and make this event successful. Once again, I thank to all for this attention. Thank you so much, sir, once again. Bye, sir.